Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
Nice to see you, ma'am, after this many years.
Nice to see you. It's such a nice occasion. Sorry
Yes,
for being late. I had
no,
problems
ma'am, it's
connecting
okay.
to the webcam, but here I am. Excited of so many people.
Yes, ma'am, still our participants are joining, ma'am. We are waiting for our principal, sir, and then we will start the proceeding.
Yeah, no problem. While we wait, can I ask you if the audio is okay?
Yes, ma'am, your audio is just fine.
I have a very noisy aircon, but it's very hot.
No, no, ma'am,
I
it's
will
okay, ma'am.
switch it off if you understand it properly.
Your audio is just fine, ma'am. Ma'am, our principal, sir, is joining.
Good afternoon. Good evening.
Okay. Sir, start procedure.
Yeah.
Good evening, one and all. Respected principal, sir, respected ma'am, for joining us, and all the participants who have joined us and who are gracing us in this auspicious evening. So before waiting, much further, I would like to ask our principal, sir, to please propose a formal welcome. Sir, please.
So you are on mute. So please unmute yourself.
Sorry. Namaskar and good evening, everybody. On behalf of PANCHMURA MAHAVIDYALAYA, I announce a hearty welcome both the respectable research person Dr. Valentina CAMOMILLA from Italy and Dr. Marcela Rodriguez from Mexico, joined in this webinar. They have enormous authority to their own subject. I also welcome all my colleagues, teachers, non-teaching staff, and beloved students. I am especially thankful to our young faculty members of Physical Education Department for organizing this particular webinar. In this crucial new normal situation, the whole world is suffering from corona pandemic. The situation is very tough. No one knows what is the fate of our beloved world is, what is the fate of our human civilization. But our hope is that one day it seems to be ended up. We shall overcome. That is the hope. That is the inspiration which will make the world better to best. So I believe that this webinar would be a very contemporary at this moment. It's a great pleasure and privilege to me being a part of this webinar. I would like to welcome all the eminent speakers and thank them for their sharing their valuable time, thoughts, and delivery speech. Again, I would like to convey my heartfelt gratitude to them. I would like to welcome all the audience for their active participation. I am very much thankful to the technical team for their support. Finally, not entering into the subject matter, I wish a grand success of this webinar. and would like to congratulate again all the people associated with this. Thank you all, and I declare the beginning of this webinar. Namaskar.
Thank you so much, sir. So let me introduce ma'am first, Dr. Valentina CAMOMILLA, as I met her back in 2016 when I was doing my master's back in Gwalior, and then we exchanged our thoughts. Ma'am also enlightened me with her knowledge, and still then we are in contact, and I am so pleased that ma'am joined us and she accepted my proposal. So let me introduce ma'am first, and then we can start our proceeding. Ma'am has MS degree in electronical engineering in the year 2000 and a PhD in bioengineering in the year 2004. She is currently a professor at University of Rome, Foro Italico. Her research focuses on increasing the resolution of human movement analysis performed using stereophotogrammetry, addressing soft tissues artifacts and anatomical calibration approaches, qualitative and quantitative technique and performance analysis in sports. Professor CAMOMILLA serves as a board of directors of the 3D analysis of human movement technical group of the ISB since 2018. She is also an associate editor for Frontiers in Sports and Active Living since 2019, and also in the field of sports biomechanics since 2019. She co-authored 46 peer-reviewed publications and co-supervised 4 postdocs and 9 PhD candidates, and also 40 MSc students' theses. Her research activities since 2001 to till date in the field of human movement analysis focuses on development of algorithms and protocols for improving the resolution of human movement analysis and their applications for quantitative characterization of motor capacity and function in sporting, clinical, and ergonomic contexts carried out in the laboratory or in the field. She also has international collaboration with countries like UK, Australia, France, Israel, and USA. She has received the famous Elsevier Award for the best scientific papers 2 times. She has also received PhD award Paulo Durst in September 2005. She currently the associate editor for Frontiers in Sports and Active Living Sports Sciences and Technology and Engineering for the reputed publisher Taylor and Francis in Sports Biomechanics. She was also a former member of editorial board of Sports Biomechanics since 2019 to 2020, the Journal of Medical Engineering since 2012 to 2017, and the Journal of Healthcare Engineering since 2015 to 17. And also, she was also an active member of Jacobs Journal of Sports Sciences from 2016 to 18. So this was the brief review, I would say, which I could gather for ma'am, and the CV was huge. And I must say, ma'am, it was really impressive, and we are so blessed that you joined us. So, ma'am, the stage is yours. Please address the gathering. Thank you, ma'am.
You always embarrass me with all this list of things, but I must remember that it was 20 years time and that I did them one by one and enjoyed them all, as I'm enjoying the idea of sharing some thoughts and knowledge with you this afternoon, which is a summary of recent ideas I gathered around the topic of investigating movements in sports. So I will not specifically focus on sensors, which is my typical expertise, but I included in my presentation a lot of references, which I would be delighted to share with you as a list of papers that could expand your readings if you want to go deeper into the topic we're discussing today. So just a justification of being not going in depth on all subjects, but having the will to have an overview of many values. I'll explain it in a minute. So before starting with the actual talk, sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Not yet, ma'am. I guess it will come.
Can you see my screen?
Not yet, ma'am.
Now should see. I never did it with Meet, but apparently it should be live, but you don't see it, right?
No, ma'am.
Hmm?
Not yet, ma'am. Ma'am, there is an option for present now. You can click on that, and then you can share your screen.
Yeah, no, I did it. It's just didn't. It says that I'm sharing my screen, but you don't see it. So on my side, I see sharing your screen, and I can stop sharing. But
Okay.
okay.
Or ma'am, you can mail me the paper. I can project it from here, if that be okay.
Okay. Not really, because I had a game to play on a web service and two presentations. So it was a mix of things, but I can share and keep it simple.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, you can try and ma'am, I guess no.
I did try before this meeting, but it did succeed. So I was safe. That
I think we are
work.
getting something.
Allora. Can you just wait a minute? And
Sure.
I'll because I understand what's going on. My computer is actually very going into some problems at the moment. This is why it's not working, I think.
No problem, ma'am. You can take your time.
No, I'm sorry to embarrass you.
No problem. Not at all.
Okay, so what I am actually sending the presentation to you if it uploads.
Yeah, ma'am. Now you are visible. Now it's
But
coming.
this will take a little time.
Oh, she left the meeting, I guess. I would request participants to wait for a second. Maybe there are some technical glitches and she will join again. Yes, ma'am. I received your presentation. I'm just presenting it.
Okay.
It's a request to all the participants. Please mute your microphone.
I made another attempt to share my screen. If it works, I prefer this way. If it doesn't, you can proceed.
Yes, ma'am. It's coming.
Did you?
Yeah.
You
It's
see the
visible,
screen
ma'am.
now?
Yeah, ma'am. It's visible. Very much visible.
Perfect. Okay, I'll try to recover some time. So I was asking you, but the connection failed, to connect to this game, to tell me a little bit about you, and I copied the link into the chat of the meeting, but you also have the QR code here. And if you want to join with me, I just have a couple of questions for you that will help me focus on aspects you are more interested in too. So if you can click the QR code or link directly, I would be happy to ask you what you expect to learn, because this is my first question to you. You just go to the this link and answer to this question. Every answer you put will require one submission. So you can write a single word to say what you expect to learn. And could you connect with it?
Yes, ma'am. It's connected.
I don't see any coming. Something new. Good. Someone wants to know about sensors. You can also switch on your microphone and tell something if you want. If you have problems accessing the app, it's the same. It's nice to see the cloud building up, but it's always nice to hear voices as well.
if you want to say something to ma'am, please, you're most welcome. You can share your thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. You can talk.
Yeah.
Or I can tell you what I have in mind, and then at the end you can tell me if that matched your expectations, which remain very broad, which is good. I'm an enthusiast of new things and knowledge in any domain, because being focused only on one domain, of course, is important for scientists because you need to have a focus. But being curious is what makes you more alive and makes your research life or students' life more exciting. Of course, you are scientists and you're interested in sports and in innovations. The title of the seminar goes in this direction, of course. Biomechanics, of course, yes. I knew things in biomechanics, which merges the two. Actually, my focus on movements in sports is mostly on the biomechanical perspective. Of course, there's a lot, much more on sport monitoring and innovations, which I'm not covering, and I'm not expert in, but okay. Gualir, that's where some of you come from. I still have my symbol of Gualir University on my desk behind me. Okay, so now that I have an idea of a group of curious people wanting to be more informed of what's going on and to stay updated, I share my screen and I will go along the 5 whys scheme, which is always good to present the team and cover the different aspects. It's not 5 bubbles. I have a 6th, which is a now, which is actually, I think, the most important part of this presentation. By the way, but let's go W by W. So let's start from the why. Whatever you intend to measure in life, not in life, in research life, it's always essential to start with the whys. So why movement monitoring is important in sports. Not necessarily measuring it, but also simply observing it with a systematic, although subjective approach. Because performance evaluation is at the core of a correct approach to coaching. You want to observe the athlete, you want to analyze the deterministic details of performance that make the performance successful, and you want to use this observation to provide appropriate feedbacks to the athlete. If they're accurate, it's good, but they must also be useful and timely. Not too much information, not unessential information. And in general, you aim to specifically target defects. So why observing? Because it gets into the process of enhancing performance. If you think of what we want to observe or measure, there are 2 perspectives we can follow. This is more on the sports science view. The second I will present is more on an engineering perspective, the list of variables that can be measured. But this comes first. So around the athlete's performance, we have a lot of elements that influence it. We call it sport performance model, which is a general model here, but then of course can be personalized to different sports. And if you restrict to the areas around the athlete's performance influenced by movement, we still have a lot of information that can influence it. So technique, composed of motor skills and coordination, are the outcome of a set of the other factors, and is sustained. This is why it's below, I think. Binek divided it. I'm only interpreting this thought. I think performance capacity built of force, rapidity, resistance, and flexibility sustains the other performance that expands and expresses through technique. Both areas can be subjected to observation or quantitative gathering of information through measuring movement. Of course, it is a completely different story if you're looking at team sports, individual sports, sports where there's open skills or closed skills. If you have interactions with objects and with elements like water, or if you are on a wheelchair, each sport will have its own model, but all of these models will need to look into these factors. And this is what you can observe. Looking at this what in a different way, more detailed in terms of measurable quantities, again, this is more of a summary of a biomechanics course, because the key measurable quantities entail kinematics and kinetics. Quantity is important in mechanics. But if you are in the sports biomechanics domain, and I'm not telling you anything new because you've studied it, I'm sure, but it is important to have this in mind. You start from the phase analysis of what you observe or you are observing. So you have, for example, in running, here you see a depiction of a motion capture snapshot. We measured a runner in our lab, and I took this image as an example. To analyze this huge amount of data coming from a biomechanics lab, you need to have clear ideas of what you want to observe. So you first divide the stance phase from the flight phase, and you have completely different needs and objectives in the different phases of a sport task. And only after dividing into phases, you go into detecting the key quantities essential to performance. And these quantities can then be listed here without a list of importance. But each of them should be selected if measuring it contributes to answer to the specific question. So is the stance phase efficient enough not to lose velocity when performed? Whatever other question requires measuring these quantities. And you can go from the simpler time and frequency parameters, which you see depicted, towards the more complex. So the kinematic quantities could be the step length or the progression displacement of the center of mass. Or you can have orientations, so we go from meters, length to angles, and you can have single body orientations like trunk inclination, or relative orientation of body segments, meaning joint kinematics. Or you can look at kinetics. Of course, kinetics complements kinematics, and you can have braking impulses or propulsive impulses, the ratio between them, or other variables you see here listed. Again, I'm not telling you anything new, but this list is useful to be kept in mind because this is what you can measure, and you need to know what variables can be measured reliably. This will come later, and to which question your why requires which specific quantities. So we keep this list for later, and we shift to the where. We have substantially two options, and in between these two extremes, we either perform the model task into the laboratory, or we take the laboratory onto the field. Of course, the recent trend is towards the right-hand side, because wearables have become more and more present in everyday life, and their cost is truly becoming smaller and smaller. I'm searching for my mobile, but I imagine, yes, here it is. Imagine to have your mobile in your hands, and you have plenty of sensors inside the mobile which you can exploit. So, of course, we go from the very sophisticated laboratory expensive instrumentation, very accurate information, to the other extreme where you have experiments in the field, ecological settings, and potentially cheaper instrumentation as low as the cost of sensors in immobile, at the cost of accuracy. So let's look into this with more detail. Why choosing the lab or the field? The answer is not obvious. In this slide, and in general terms, we tend towards going to the lab, to the field, because it provides you with information that the laboratory may not provide you. So I don't know if you remember this story because it's a little old today. It's back in 2008. So for the youngest among you, this might seem far away. But anyways, Oscar Pistorius in Rome, he was competing. He was a double lower leg not amputee. He was born without his lower legs, and he was competing with two prostheses within able-bodied in the Golden Gala, which was not an official competition, and he won. After this race, he asked the official IAAF to compete with able-bodied athletes, and was denied access to this competition and was tested in lab settings. Two different labs performed the assessment in lab and gave opposite results, suggesting that he could and could not participate with his peers. What you see in this graph is the speed that Pistorius had compared with elite counterparts. And you see what happens in the distance intervals through the track, which was 400 meters. And you see that the athlete first lose time against his elite athletes, years, and then increased his speed to actually win the race. So the message here, going into the field allows not only an ecological assessment, but also to observe facts and things that in the lab are not accessible at all, such as what happens at the end of a 400-meter race. So performance evaluation is best performed in a non-standardized environment and for long periods of time. That's the take-home message, if you can. The model task into the lab still has some valuable information, because when you control the environment, you also control all factors that could confound your analysis, like people around the athlete supporting or being against the athlete. And you have better performing instruments. So I'm not against the lab, but of course I'm interested into expanding the accuracy and potential of wearables to increase the quality of the assessment outside of the lab. Just a second. I want to keep an eye on time. So, having said that, and I told you the how is the most important, I recently became more and more interested into not only measuring accurate information, but also working, changing my mindset towards providing actionable insights. It is not enough to have a good measure. It is important that you extract the useful information. As my slide at the beginning, you need to have an accurate, useful, and timely feedback. How can you make your insights actionable? How can a coach benefit from the analysis you perform? Or if you are the coach, what do you expect to receive as information from the analysis of movement? In this slide, I took information from the web, and the nicest examples I found were for tennis, where you see on the left the image of the movement of the player on the field, which somehow visually give you an information on what's going on the field, and on the right, several different information and scores and points that are summarized for a coach to quickly perceive what's important. To go from data to actionable insights, there's a lot of things that I think deserve attention. And this part is the one that the sports scientists should develop most to fill the gap, to bridge the gap between the field, coaches, and the research. This list of points, you find it in an editorial, which is a suggested read. There's a lot of interesting things. It's a word of caution, not against, to make a wise use of wearables, and includes this list, which says that before you can actually get to actionable insights, you need to have measures that provide practical value. So it's not enough to measure, you need to have useful information for the real world. And the system should be as simple as complex, but as simple as required to be used to take decisions. Of course, it is important that the information is accurate, but it must be accurate enough to support a decision if you want to have actionable insights. The third point is important because of artificial intelligence, and this list actually comes from using artificial intelligence into the clinical setting. I adapted it for sports. Because if you, as a doctor, receive a diagnosis based on a set of data fed to an artificial intelligence, you really want to understand how the neural network or the artificial intelligence got to that diagnosis. Similarly, in the sport domain, you want to be able to explain how it works. So a system that gives you an insight and a suggestion, before trusting it, you want to understand why it reaches a conclusion. A defect in artificial intelligence is that often the process that goes from the data to the information, to the insight, is hidden. It's not because someone wants to hide it, because the very concept of artificial intelligence doesn't disclose the process that leads from data to information. But for this information to be useful, it is important that part of this process can be explained. And of course, you need to have valid and reliable information, because if you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. So the quality of the information you use to extract information is essential. And at the end of this list, the skepticism, sorry for the bad English for this word, is essential to use it appropriately. Never trust blindly whatever information comes from fancy applications or from the literature. You always need to think twice or wisely about the value of the information you are using. So that's the most important slide in this presentation, if you want to know. But I have many more, which goes into the, still stays into the how, because these actionable insights should be given to coaches and athletes, and this feedback could be provided at many different levels. It could be a simply visual feedback. This is a very sophisticated and expensive feedback, because this is a suite of inertia sensors providing an avatar moving exactly as the athlete. But you can have much simpler visual feedbacks, like a dot moving on the screen and providing a feedback on how you're moving your hand. Whatever visual feedback, it's usually very effective into planning interventions. Or you can go to very sophisticated measures. In this example, you have two sensors. We have two sensors placed on a cricket player, very famous cricket player, which elbow flexion extension was under assessment to test for is it illegal action, potential illegal action. And these estimated quantities could drive an assessment of the illegality of this player. It is a completely different feedback we are extracting, and a different actionable insight, because the former, the visual feedback, could drive the execution of a task to avoid an injury, to increase performance. The second is, of course, more towards legality and towards the referee action. And here comes the artificial intelligence, which could apply the former or the latter, to provide feedbacks or to support the refereeing actions. All artificial intelligence processes are built on this pipeline, which is very attractive and is in the hype of the research at the moment. But there's a lot of, not drawbacks, but criticalities. So you need big data, structured and unstructured data, which are generated and stored to be able then to process them and extract patterns that could drive decision-making processing that can build actionable insights. This big part is very critical if we don't have data, but the open data process is going towards making more and more data available. So this is something that we hope to see increasing in the future. So if you are good at implementing artificial intelligence algorithm and you have good ideas towards actionable insights, you can hope that sooner or later big data will become more and more available for you to apply your algorithms. Another important point in this actionable insights build is that to bridge the disconnect, you need to create a context specific to the evaluation. For example, if you are trying to prevent ACL injuries, or if you're retraining the running gait of an athlete to prevent an injury or a re-injury, these are completely different settings. You need to identify the correct form and the deviations to the correct form according to a clinical consensus. So you need to inform your actionable insight system with information specific to the specific application. This is an injury prevention framework, which I'm particularly keen of talking about, but it could apply also to performance. And once you have the framework in place and you have clinical consensus on what is right and what is wrong, you can then gather data to specific movements, right and wrong, in order to train the system to recognize these features. And only then you can devise your system, which requires to identify if the exercise performed is correct or not, identify a specific deviation, and then have an actuation strategy. So to have actionable insights, you not only need to have good measures, but also to interpret them in the light of right and wrong, and to devise a strategy to actuate a correction. So without all this pipeline in place, you can't only simply measure, you can't get to actionable insights. So these two, the checklist from Hughes and this work from Whelan are the two main papers I would look into with detail. But there's a lot of other good papers out there, and this is still on the how pipeline. And this work is expands a little bit on the feedback concept to reduce discontinuation from running. In this case, running, of course, gathers a lot of interest, but this scheme can be applied to other sports. And I suggest this read because it looks into other aspects, not only on technique, but also on motivation and on reasons for discontinuation, and on how to implement a feedback system that takes into account all these factors, not only the trivial, so to say, trivial measuring of what's right and wrong, and provide the feedback to the athlete. Because if you want to provide feedback to someone, you need to take his psychology and objectives into account. Otherwise, your feedback would be useless. So aside from a lot of good biomechanics, this paper expands on this aspect. Whatever the feedback, it could be a simple dot or light moving in space, but the way in which you use the feedback, it's something you need to think well before implementing it. Okay, so I have a couple of W's left and some literature to share. So I think I still have a quarter of an hour or so. So the when, I'm not expanding a lot on the when, but I have another key message to give. So testing periodization can be performed in several different ways. In this slide, you see training periodizations. So it's not testing, that's training, but it gives you a visual idea of, you know it well if you are coaches or trainers or athletes. So when to test in this complex time frame? At the beginning, middle, and end of season, that could be a rough testing that could give you an idea of your team or your athlete, but very rarely would provide you a feedback on the quality of your and trends in your training. So would it be enough to have a weekly weekly testing? Of course, this could burden the athlete and the team because it's time consuming, but at the same time could provide you a much faster mean to intervention if something's wrong. Or you can adapt your testing according to the training stimuli. If you want to observe the effect of a specific training stimuli, you can test it according to the time of adaptation, or you can test continuously. Of course, different testings would require different timings. You can't have a yo-yo test in the soccer football field, which is an exhaustion test once a week. But you can have a daily report on rate of perceived exertion, a training diary from the athlete, monitoring of his sleep, or quantities that can be easily measured and do not cost time and effort to the athletes, and other quantities could be measured weekly or in the different time frames. Timing is essential, not to have too many tests, but also to have the right ones. The last point is particularly interesting in the framework of complex systems, which I've been recently become interested into. I'm very fond of this paper, and I'm telling everybody about it, because I think this is not necessarily the direction for research, but you need to be aware of it. So what's the key message in this paper? Again, we are talking about sport injuries and forecasting injuries. The point in this paper is that injury is not a simple system. It does not consist of single events or factors. Not only is enough to look at relationship between these factors, such as in complicated systems, but to forecast injuries, you need to look at the system as a whole. So all factors should be looked at the same time, like hormonal factors, sleep factors, biomechanical factors, training loads, and so on, to develop a model that can get as close to predict an injury before it happens. It's not simple. It requires continuous monitoring. It's not necessarily possible, but being aware of it may let you focus on the right research questions. So I read a lot of literature. We are currently revising the literature on assessing and preventing risk of injury with the wearables, with inertia sensors and pressure sensors. There's a lot of literature focusing on specific factors and trying to correlate them with the injury after this injury occurred. There's a lot of controversial results. The reason why results are not matching with each other, so it's very difficult to obtain good meta-analysis results, for example, in running injuries with wearables, is because the systems that are under observation are complex and the assessments are not continuous. So I think a small number of tests of a complex system results into describing a relationship or the opposite of this relationship and not being able to actually develop a forecasting system. I don't know what's the solution, but reading this paper made me aware of how much research could have been avoided, not to waste too much time onto searching local relationships that did not take into account the time, continuous time, and the complexity of the phenomenon. So this is a mixture of how and when, but of course the when gets into the how, continuously or monthly, it's a how. And last W, the who is the easiest, meaning that this assessment is in the hands of several professional people, being them researchers, engineers, model scientists, sport biomechanists, movement analysts, and kinesiologists. So I don't know under which name you would identify yourself, but each of these person in this slide has a role which is complementary, because all of them look at causes and effects of a sport technique. Maybe engineers could call them kinetics and kinematics, and the coach could call it cause and effect, or whatever wording, but all these actors have the same interest, even if they call the quantities in different ways. So before going to the end, I want to spend a few more minutes on what has been done so far. So we revised the literature on sport performance assessment with IMUS, and we are revising it on prevent, assess, and inform recovery from injury. And we did some work on supporting athletes with disability, always with wearables, which are full of ideas, but also full of problems. I will not spend time onto the problems of wearables, which you may find listed into one of the reviews I'm citing. So the potential of these wearables, which was listed before, is still limited by some of these limitations. So the quantities in red, namely most of the spatial kinematic variables like step length or instantaneous velocity, and orientation of body segments in case the sensor fusion, the algorithms to perform the orientation estimate are not robust enough, and dynamic variables should be looked with suspicion. So before trusting them, whatever you read or buy as an app or as a sensor should be taken with caution. So you need to be aware of the limitations of the specific quantity you're using, you're obtaining from a sensor, before trusting it, before using it for taking actions. There's a lot of literature working on countermeasures to these limitations. Mostly, I grouped them within two domains. One is sensor fusion, so algorithms to perform better estimates. I particularly like the magnetometer-free approaches, because the magnetometer, one of the sensors embedded into MyMuse, is particularly prone to ferromagnetic disturbances, which are difficult to control in a real world environment. But other class of countermeasures which require intelligence, prior knowledge, are promising for specific sports, like the cyclic ones, because they use tags embedded into the sport task. Like, for example, if you jump during flight, your center of mass acceleration equals g. This kind of a priori knowledge is embedded more and more into the algorithms to compensate for these limitations. In all cases, you should not trust unless you have accuracy, data sheets, and publications validating the quality of the measures you're extracting. And there's a lot of literature doing this work for you. And this is a list of titles that our lab and collaborators in our research groups developed. And I will spend a few more minutes on some of the outcomes of the Preventing, Assessing, Informing Recovery from Injuries paper, which is not published yet because you can read the sport performance paper and the guidelines which I already mentioned. So let's look at the injury profile. The sport performance will drive you, if you go and read it, through what has been done and can be done in technique analysis, in capacity assessment, in match analysis, and in activity classification. Capacity assessment means that you perform tests, standardized tests, to measure what was at the bottom of the athlete performance scheme I presented at the beginning. Match analysis is mainly performed with GPS and accelerometer systems in team sports, while technique analysis covers a whole lot of different sports and tasks. Divided here, you see, in cyclic sports and winter sports. Wearables increasingly expanded the potential of testing outdoors that were not tested before. So water sports, winter sports cannot be tested with photogrammetric systems or even video cameras because they have huge volumes of action. And so wearables really changed the game, the landscape of what has been assessed. I'll skip the technique analysis, but you have a whole list of the sports and the parameters assessed in each specific sport. And if Chandan wants, I can share the slides which have a lot of references in between, pointing you towards further expansions of this knowledge. But I want to spend a little more time on the injury, which is more recent. We tried to figure out what would be the interesting research questions to design an injury profile for an athlete. And we thought that assessing sport-related risk of injuries and predictive factors would have been the most easy to perform research, which actually came out to be true, because out of the we actually have 200 papers now, but sort of out of 173, most of the papers were simply assessing the risk factors. It is much more complex to understand sport-related injury mechanisms because you need to simulate them and you can't really put your athlete at risk. And I was expecting to have more information on devices that could protect against injury. In this literature, we excluded concussions, so head injuries are in a lot of papers, but we didn't focus on them. And we looked more at the musculoskeletal system, which was poorly protected. So there's some shoes studies mainly designed to understand how the shoe can prevent the injury, but very rarely the shoe is analyzed within this perspective. And gait retraining, already mentioned, is a niche in research, very structured and very nicely carried out, but not so applied in all countries. It's a typical USA wording and practice that is not so applied in other countries. And finally, we thought that wearables had a huge potential to support post-injury monitoring or return to play, but the literature does not agree so far. I think in 5 years' time, this picture will change because artificial intelligence will support developing post-injury monitoring systems. But we need data to develop reliable information that allows an athlete to return to sport based on a measure, because we need thresholds information on when it is safe for the athlete to go back to practice. So the literature at the pre-stage is much bigger than the literature at injury or post-injury. This will come out soon, somewhen, so I'll invite you to give a look and see what's going on. Sorry, but I need to recover the delay of my technical problems. And this last one is, again, a niche in research, but the athletes with the disability are not so few, and they're increasing in numbers because participation in sport is supported, at least in Europe. There's a huge, not pressure, money to support this initiative. And so here we identified the potential of use of wearables for this class of athletes. And these areas are specific to them. So they have sport equipment that are different, for example, wheelchairs to be used in sport, and their customization can be supported by wearables. Sport equipment customization can apply also to able-bodied athletes, but in this specific case, they adapt to the needs of the specific disability. And performance characterization is still along the same line of the previous papers, but in this case, the optimization of training requires taking into due account the performance limitations specific to the athlete with the specific disability, which requires also preventing specific injuries. And last but not least, the evidence-based need that is called for since 2013 from the International Paralympic Committee is supported by wearables. So the IPC in 2013 wrote a position paper saying all sports for disabled athletes with disability should be classified, so athletes should be divided into classes that allow them to have an equitable competition. These classes should not be based on the disability itself, but on the evidence of how this disability affects the performance potential. So classifying the athletes along these evidence-based rules is very difficult and requires measures which can be performed with wearables. So this is, again, a niche in research, but a very interesting one because it combines personalized sport coaching with capacity testing within a domain that it's difficult because the athlete might want to be classified with less abled athletes. So the system should include an anti-cheating approach, which is ethically not very nice, but essential. And in this case, the wheelchair is the most tested instrument and sport. So you see at the moment this research domain is dominated by the assessments into wheelchair, basketball, rugby, racing, and tennis and curling, a lot of wheelchairs. But there's expansion, there's space for expansion in this domain as well. So to sum it up, current trends in the literature is to investigate more and more elite and sub-elite athletes in competition and training fields. Assessments in competition depend on the rules of the specific sports. Not all sports allow testing during competition. Individual sports technique is more frequently analyzed, particularly for cyclic sports, which could be due by the fact that technique is more important to performance in individual sports. So more interest, money, time goes into the most important factors, but also because cyclical sports, which are largely practiced, offer solutions for solving some measuring issues, as I mentioned before. The fact that a movement cyclical gives you an a priori information that you can embed in algorithms to estimate parameters related to this cyclical sport with wearables. And so I don't know what comes first in this cause-effect relationship, but the fact is that individual sports are the most common using wearables. And the tasks, you can read them, are running, throwing, doing, rowing, and swimming, which, with the exception of throwing and swimming, are mostly cyclical. And the parameters that prevailingly derived are the most accurate, with the exception of center of mass kinematics, which is actually assessed in terms of rough acceleration and intensity. At the moment, the majority of the literature focuses on describing either the technique or the risk of injury factors, rather than developing tools to change these factors. But the trend is towards developing tools driven by artificial intelligence. So again, in 5-10 years time, this scenario will completely change, my guess, and I'm not sure, of course. And to reduce risk of injury, work needs to be done in a real-time feedback domain, which requires measuring predictive factors and should be used in a long-term perspective to develop forecasting systems. And last but not least, so besides assessing performance for wheelchair sports, wearables have the potential to facilitate participation for athletes with disability. So this is my summary on sports. I have one last thing to share, which is something that came out from the COVID period. So we couldn't do research, of course, in the lab, and we did teaching at home. So to teach my students how to use wearables, I discovered an application, a web, an application and a web page, which is named fifox.org, where you can download a software that allows you to access the sensors embedded in your smartphone. I did this for teaching, so I had the students testing themselves while at home, which was sort of nice. Instead of having them in the lab, they could still have a hint of experimental activities. But then we, with a PhD student in our lab, we decided to use the sensor to measure vertical jump. And we call it democratization of the procedure, because of course the smartphone is easy to use, and it's not cheap, but you have it anyways. And we tested for the accuracy of this procedure, which will come out in the ISP conference next week, in 2 weeks' time. But the message here is think of using the sensors you have at hand, but of course being aware of the limitations that could be entailed into this measure. Sorry for being slightly late with respect to the time you gave me, but I hope it was that you can forgive me.
Hello, ma'am. I think there are some technical issues. Please be patient and she will resume her presentation again. And meanwhile, if you have some questions regarding this presentation, you may ask it. We can take few questions now after she joins again.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
I lost the connection. I don't know when I lost you. What
No,
did
no
you,
problem, ma'am.
what was the
So,
last thing you heard?
ma'am, we saw all your presentation, ma'am. Actually, when you paused it, then it went off.
When?
Just when you were switching it off, ma'am, then only it went off.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. I was saying that I'm open to your questions, but I didn't hear you anymore.
Yes. So it's a request to all the participants. If they have any question to ma'am, then they can ask it. We can take few questions now. Anyone from the participant side? The house is open for question and answers.
I might ask you one, and then you ask me one back.
Ma'am, I have one question, ma'am, actually.
Okay, I can answer first.
Okay. Ma'am, as you said in your slides, like while controlling the environment for analysis part, for like when we are controlling the environment, like either we are doing it in, either we are taking the data in the field or in the lab.
So I didn't understand the whole. I understood the either in the field or in the lab, but
Yeah. So
the
ma'am,
first part, sorry.
Yeah, so ma'am, if we are taking the data in the lab,
Yes.
and how the means, then we are controlling, basically controlling the natural environment. Like if you want to take the data of a 400-meter runner and we are taking it in a lab situation, then basically we are controlling the environment, the natural environment. So how it is affecting the data and how we can minimize it through sensors and through the latest equipments and gadgets.
If I understood your question correctly, you can't, of course, reproduce the 400 meters situation in the lab. This is why you need to go outside and test with the sensors outside the lab. You can't really export one situation to the other, if that was the question.
Yes, ma'am. That was the question, ma'am.
Okay, so the problem with the Pistorius was exactly this one. In the lab, to summarize, they said that his prosthesis would give him a mechanical advantage, but the problem with the 400-meter race is that you have a metabolic cost of the run, which is consumed by the muscles of the lower limb, which this athlete doesn't have. In the lab, you can test the performance of the prosthesis, the mechanical properties, the elastic contribution, but you can't measure how the metabolic advantage changes across the run. And you can't reproduce the speed that you have in the long run, and the curvature of the 400-meter track is difficult to be reproduced. So there are several factors that you can't reproduce. Of course, all this information you observe in the lab allow you to interpret the simpler information that could come from a wearable on the trunk during the race, because you can't measure the stiffness of the prosthesis over 400 meters. We don't have force plates in all the track. The richest places in the world might have 6-7 force plates into a track. I am aware of France having these facilities. Now Italy has one, but it's one in the whole country, and very difficult being tested there. So I saw a question in the chat, which was ladder exercises makes the athlete fast. So I'm afraid, thanks for the compliment. I'm afraid that my expertise doesn't expand towards suggesting which training is more efficient. What I can contribute to is how to test pre and post to see if the exercises are effective. But the measure of velocity in terms of average velocity is not really an issue. It's very easy because you have a fixed length and you measure time. The problem I was implicitly talking about is instantaneous velocity measures, meaning that you want to measure velocity of the center of mass, for example, a heel strike or a push-off, and compare the velocity pre and post the step. So the finest grain velocity assessment. I don't know if ladder exercises could make the athlete faster, also because it would depend on the amount of training and the timing of this training within the training schedule. So I'm an engineer. I am a passive model scientist. I've been listening to and living with model scientists for 20 years now, so I've learned a little bit, but I've learned enough to know that I don't know.
Any other questions from participant side? You can just open your mic and you can just ask the question, or you can just comment it in the chat box. Okay, ma'am, I don't think, ma'am, there are any more questions left.
Yeah, but I said too many things, and they were all very general, so it's not so easy to put questions. If you want, if you could be interested, I can share with you the list of papers that I presented and talked about. It's rather big, and I currently can't share through the chat, but I'll send it to you, and you can decide what to do with it. And I will stay to listen. I will switch off my camera, and I'm eager to learn more because I'm interested to new things and insights as the other participants are. So I'm looking forward to the next presentation. Thanks again for inviting me, and good luck for your research.
Thank you so much.
I can send the presentation, yes. Okay. I will send the PDF to Dr. Kumar.
Sure, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, you can share with me. I will share it with all the participants.
I will.
Thank you, ma'am.
चंदन सर अपने आप को अनम्यूट करो, म्यूट पे हो आप.
Thank you, Amrit. Okay, ma'am very well spoke about the athlete's performance and how the different factors it influences the performance of the athletes. She also spoke about the different phases like the stance phase and other phases which are responsible, like by which we can uplift the performance of the athlete. And she also spoke about how to bridge the gap between field and also the research work, because while doing researches, we do lots of researches, but we don't apply it in the field. So it's very much obvious, like if we are doing any kind of research, then we should apply it in the field also. And how the artificial intelligence, like how through artificial intelligence, we can improve the performance of the athletes. So this were the main points that ma'am, she covered, and there were many important points that she covered. So thank you so much, ma'am, once again. And I would like to request our next resource person, my friend, Dr. Marcela Rodriguez, so to please come up and start the presentation. Marcela, can you hear me?
Yes, here I am.
So before, sorry to interrupt. Before I let you hold the podium, I would like to just give you a brief introduction to the audience. So she is a nutritionist and also a scientist who is passionate for clinical research. Her main line of research is intestinal barrier, microbiota, and its metabolites. In the understanding of bacterial infections during the progression of liver cirrhosis, Dr. Marcela has a PhD in molecular biology in medicine from University of Guadalajara, Mexico. She is a trained and certified diabetic nutrition and also in nutrition and kidney diseases. Though she belongs to a Spanish-speaking nation, but her TOEFL score in English is 610, which is quite amazing. Since 2020, she is working as a scientist in the Laboratory of Diagnosis of Emerging and Re-emerging Diseases. Along with teaching at the University of Guadalajara, Mexico, she has also working as a nutritional counselor with special emphasis in kidney disease and sports nutrition as well. She has also worked with San Xavier Hospital, Guadalajara in the Department of Dietology. She has also completed a research collaboration with Pediatric Hospital of Centro Médico Nacional Medical Research Unit in Nutrition Molecular Biology Laboratory. So the stage is all yours, Marcela. Please, embrace us with your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this gently and quite nice presentation. So, as you just said, yes, I'm a nutritionist and my PhD is in molecular biology, and my thesis was mostly oriented into microbiota and cirrhosis, bioinformatics, and all that things in that context. However, as you all have suffered as well as here in my country, well, COVID-19 pandemic just put a little bit of a difference into what we were working. In my case, I got into this diagnosis laboratory, and well, my research scope went from microbiota to a little bit of virus and the immune response, which I've been working with since last year. And well, it's been a quite thrilling journey and really interesting topic. So let me start sharing my presentation, and I hope you just get what I'm trying to transmit to you. And if there are any doubts, I really wish that you could ask me at last of the presentation. So let me share. Okay, so you hear me well? The presentation is showing well?
Yeah, it is very much visible. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, what is the topic that I'm going to talk about right now? It's just a brief information about what are Cd8 cells in the context of the disease of COVID-19. So it's quite an extensive topic, but I'll try to go through some little by little things and to take you by the hand so we can understand this. So first of all, I'm going to explain you a little overview about SARS-CoV-2, its epidemiology and pathogenesis. Then we'll walk through the disease, the COVID-19, and then we'll get into the immune response and talking into special emphasis into adaptive T cell immunity, so we can then go to talk about the Cd8 subtypes and what are their job in our body, in the host, and then the alteration that we can see of this T cell subset into the context of COVID-19. And finally, we're gonna get just like into some really specific topic that will be what is happening in the local immune response, like in the lung, and also, well, the alterations that are seen locally in COVID-19. At last, I will just talk a little bit about the ongoing projects of the laboratory that I'm working on, as well as just some take-home messages, like really key points that you can take home and you can just keep those messages with you. So let's start with the presentation. Let's go with SARS-CoV-2 epidemiology. So as you most know, when it started, it was late 2019. It was in Wuhan, China, and there were just plenty of patients that were attending into the hospital with like pneumonia. and doctors didn't know what it was, and there was researchers who start analyzing. They identified the etiologic agents, and well, they tried to contain it. However, there was a quickly spread of the virus, and it became a global threat. Now, this was just talked into the WHO. The president of the WHO, he was just alerting all of the countries, but most of the countries didn't take into action. However, thanks to the WHO and other countries, actions were taken into place. So it was declared a pandemic on March 11th of last year. And by that time, there were 119 cases, and there were about 4,000 deaths. So in that time, we were scared, and it seemed like a lot. But if we see the map that it's on top, let me check if there's, okay. So here in the map, in the top part, we've got now around 180 million cases, and it means, or with the deaths that we have, it's almost 4 million deaths. So it's been just a huge difference from when it started, and yes, the cases are slowing down and people are getting vaccinated, but still COVID-19 represents a global threat, and we don't know at what time it could just go up again. You just, actually in your country, you just live that horrible wave again. So it's important to continue the investigation about this disease and possible treatments as well as vaccination. So now if I go locally at my country in Mexico, we've got around 2.5 million cases, and the deaths is around 2,000 cases of deaths. So what's the importance here? It's not the number, it's also the percentage. I mean, how lethal the disease is. And that's why I like really this map from here that you can see from the left side of the screen. So popular countries that we heard a lot during the pandemic were, of course, China. And here we see the case fatality rate, which it's kind of an approximate number or percentage of the risk or how are the odds that someone might die from the disease. So China, it's around 5%, 4%, something like that. For Mexico, it's quite higher. So even though we didn't have maybe just the percentage of cases that United States had, we have a worse case fatality rate. So that just made people here like really, really preoccupied. Now, if we see like your country, India, is much lower. So maybe there will be more cases, but people are not that dying. Anyhow, we need to continue the research to know why are this difference ongoing. Is it just, like health problem? Is it genetics? Is it the virus? What's happening in there? Now, if I go like really into where I live, is said here, it's Jalisco, and we have one of the most populated cities in the country, but we took good action since the beginning. Actually, the laboratory that I'm still working at was of great contribution because we helped the government into taking actions into place, because there were not enough people working in molecular biology, and we didn't have the much resources to make the tests. So that's why the laboratory where I was, it was a key part of the pandemic. So now let's talk about a little bit about the virus. I mean, like why it was so important, and why does it cause this so much threat and so much spreading if it's just a virus, as it could be any other virus. So first of all, it's the third zoonotic human coronavirus of the century, but it is the first coronavirus to cause a pandemic. Its genetic sequence, it's very similar to SARS-CoV-1. Let's remember here that there were another coronavirus that were like really lethal and they were at risk of causing a pandemic, but they could be, or they weren't controlled. It was the MERS and SARS-CoV-1. There are other coronaviruses that also cause disease, but they won't cause the severity that we've seen in this COVID-19 context. So if we go into phylogenetics, coronavirus goes from the family Coronavirinae, and its genera is from the Vira coronavirus. There are 4 genera of this family. Now, why they're called coronavirus is because of the corona, that it's the word for making just like a crown, that it looks like this spike protein that the virus has. Going into like deeper context, the virus, it's a positive strand, single strand RNA, and it's about 30 kilobases. So this gives the virus a really nice characteristic that when it infects the cell, it can replicate kind of easier, in an easier way or more direct way. Now, it has 4 structural proteins that are marked here in this beautiful diagram. It is the nucleocapsid or N protein. Then we have also the spike, which is quite famous or popular. We've got also the membrane protein or M and the envelope protein or E. Most of these, maybe you've heard them because of mutations, because of the transmission, because of the maybe how the course of the disease, and also because those structural proteins aid into the diagnosis of the virus. So which of these is most important? Well, all of them are necessary for the virus to be formed, but the S protein is critical for the virus that could infect. This is why this particular spike protein from SARS-CoV-2 has a higher reproductive number. This is what this means is how many people, like if I am infected, how many people I infect if I have SARS-CoV-2 in my system. So SARS-CoV-2 has a higher reproductive number, higher than SARS-CoV-1, higher than MERS, higher than actually influenza 2. So this is why it became so easily spread. The spike protein had like a really good interaction with the AC2 receptor here, or also, well, the letters stand for angiotensin converting enzyme 2. So we need the spike protein of the virus to get into the cell through these important receptors. So keep in mind that this receptor is not only in the lungs, which is the alveolar epithelial cells type 2, which contain the receptor, but also in other epithelial cells. We can see it in the endothelial cells, like in the mouth. There's an interesting line of research that we know that in the salival glands, we have these AC2 receptors, and that they can work as a reservoir for the virus. That's just like a kind of a theory, but they're working on that. We also have AC2 receptors in the lung, in the kidney, and in the gut. So there's plenty of the receptor. There's plenty of places where the virus come infect and start its replication. So what I show here is just how there's the entry of the virus. It's mostly through the respiratory tract, and then it goes and infects the cells in the lung. And also here, it's just like a resume or like exemplified of how is the replication and the virus cycle of the virus. What's important here is that we have the receptor, it goes to the spike protein. We need other other proteases, just as this one, that it's always accompanying the ACE2 receptor. And this will mediate then the cytosis of the virus to go into the cell and start all the replication cycle and to form the viral particles that would go then, through the system and go infect other cells. So going into the pathology of COVID-19, we got this. It got spread also like really easy because many people were asymptomatic. It's around 1%. In some countries, they say like 5%. It's kind of a difficult number to get. But these asymptomatic people are also capable of transmitting the virus. And not only the asymptomatic, but there's also a pre-symptomatic phase of the disease that it's where most of the spread of the virus comes from. Now, 81%, so like most of the people that get infected will get into a mild course of the disease, 14%, a severe course, and 5% a critical course. The virus is transmitted via fomites and droplets, so that means that maybe if I am infected and there's some saliva droplets into some article and you touch that article and then you take your hand into your nose, into your mouth or something, then you might get infected. That will depend also on genetics, the viral load, and so forth. Now, there's some things that have been mentioned since the start of the pandemic, and that's it, that elderly people as well as people with underlying diseases or comorbidity have a higher risk of getting severely ill and will need intensive care. So most of the pandemic, that was what's happening, right? Like if you were young, you didn't saw your parents, or you didn't saw like elderly people, you didn't like really care about it. But people who were older or who had comorbidities, or people that maybe were younger but lived with them, they were like really, really scared and taking into consideration all of the recommendations, right? So let's talk a little bit about symptoms, about what the disease looks like when you get it. So this diagram that I show you in the right part of the slide is from an article that it's unpublished. It's just in its way to be published from our population. What we saw is that most people have these symptoms. It's headache, fever, nasal congestion, rhinorrhea, sore throat, and so on. So these are the same symptoms that have been reported since the start of the pandemic. And what we saw is that there were no significance in between them, at least for our population of the study. So what we do saw is that women, at least, they report more of the symptoms, and most of what they reported here, like the most symptom, it was like hypogeusia, which like you lose the flavor of the things you're eating. Also, like most people here, they just make jokes about that they couldn't smell anything, which will be anosmia. So those were like the most popular symptoms if you weren't hospitalized or you weren't like in a severe course of the disease. But then people who were like more ill got the fever, got headache, and got all these general pain like myalgia and the fatigue. Now, people who got hospitalized, mostly what they got also is of course the cough, but the difficulty breathing. And let's take into consideration that by the time that people get into hospitals, it's because they can't breathe. They don't have enough oxygen, so they get into ventilation or some ventilation support, right? So this will be the generalities of the disease. And this is a really nice timeline that separates the disease into 3 phases: the pre-symptomatic, symptomatic, and the recovery phase. So here what we got is the magnitude in the y-axis and into the y-axis, and into the x-axis, what we see are the days. So we got here is that the viral replication like really goes up in the pre-symptomatic. That's why of the spread of the disease. Now then we've got a symptomatic window where they could be separated into a mild or severe course of the disease. And here what we see is that the first thing that it happens is the innate responses, innate immune responses, just as in any other disease that we can review in a textbook, right? Then what we have is the cellular responses or the adaptive immune arm taken into place here. And what we see is that as soon as the innate immune response goes down and the cellular responses go up, then we can classify this as the mild course of the disease. However, if this is not seen and the innate response system goes up or continues to proliferate and the cellular responses just maintain, then what we get as a result is a mild disease. Now here in the back part, what we see is a humoral response. It's a slow response, but what it's referring to in this humoral response is the antibody production, B cells, plasma cells, etc. So these humoral responses are really important into the viral neutralizations and clearance, as well as the cellular responses. However, what we've seen here is that it's not like we always think. We think that more is better. Well, no, what we've seen is, or what's been reported, it is we've had a more like a stronger human response, then it could be related to a worse outcome. It's important to have a strong one, yes, but not like a stronger, because in deaf patients, what they've seen is that they got like the most elevated titers of IgG to response to SARS-CoV-2. So, well, these are the generalities. And here what we see, it's quite interesting, is the therapy that must be, taken into consideration depending on the phases. This is quite important because during the pandemic, most people, when here in Jalisco, we had like the waves and the most cases, many people called me and said like, Marcela, hey, what should I be taking? And hey, they're offering me these immunomodulators, like, should I take them? And the answer, it's always, it depends. It depends on, of course, at what time of the disease you are. It depends on how you're feeling. Like if you're asymptomatic, why would you take immunomodulators? If you're asymptomatic and your disease course is just going fine, like why would you take any pharmacol or any antiviral or something like that? So yes, and we have many therapies that are still ongoing in research. This is another nice timeline where we see the same response, but it's a little bit modified. And what I liked of this one is the part of the antibody that I was mentioning. If you can, as you can see here, like mild to moderate illness, they have a good antibody response, of course, because we need it. But if we go through severe illness or critical illness, when they got just into ICU admission, antibody titers go like really, really, really high compared to non-hospitalization setting. And what we also see here is that mild to moderate illness, the window, it's of about 10 days. I mean, it's like 2 weeks and you can go to continue your normal life, right? But if it's high CU hospitalization, or if they got acute respiratory distress syndrome, this one over here, which is one of the first complication or the most common complication of the disease, you can go even 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks with the disease, right? Now, let's get into some more interesting things here. It's about immune response. So immune response, let's remember these concepts. We've got 2 parts of the immune response. We've got the innate immunity response and the adaptive immunity. The innate immunity, it's about hours, it's really quick, but it's not specific, right? We've got epithelial barriers, we've got phagocytes, dendritic cells, the complement, which is quite important also in the disease, and natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are like the stars of viral infections. They are a type of of T lymphocyte cells. They're capable of killing infected cells, and they're like really quick, and they're good at it. So just keep in mind these NK cells. Also, phagocytes, we can see them as macrophages or as monocytes. Monocytes will be like circulating around the organism. Macrophages are specific of a tissue, like in the lung. What we could see is alveolar macrophages. Now, after some time in the infection, like maybe 1 day to 1 week, we got the adaptive immunity, which is, yes, it's slower, but it's really specific, and it needs a lot of coordination, of really good coordination and communication between and among the cells. Which cells do we have in adaptive immunity? We've got T lymphocytes, we've got effector T cells, we've got B lymphocytes that we got into the plasma cells, right? So the T lymphocyte, we could also split them into the CD4, CD8, and so on. But for these presentation, the ones that I would like you to remember is CD4 and CD8, okay? So this is also important to take into consideration into immunity, that it will recognize pathogens, but in an indirect way through the PPRs, which are the pathogen recognizing receptor, and it will recognize DAMPs and PAMPs, which are the damage or the pathogen pattern that it will be recognized by this receptor, and this will activate some signaling pathways that we got into pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines, which will help into the correct establishment of the adaptive immunity. So in summary, we need a really good innate immunity response, so there is a good adaptive immunity response. So both of them, even though they are like in a different, considered as different entities, they need of each other, okay? So now if we go into, let me just erase all this. So if we got into innate immunity and adaptive immunity into a more specific way, what we have here is the way of action. What we have here is innate immunity will get the virus here, and then what we have is that it will produce some interferons that will help into block, okay? So interferons are crucial part into the viral response. We also have the complement that will help or will aid into these part of the immune response. And here what we show, or what I'm showing you, is just a lot of different cells and things that will be happening. So of course we can got the acute inflammation and then went into healing. However, into the setting of SARS-CoV-2, we don't have this. What we have is we got into adaptive immunity. So this adaptive immunity is got into T cell, B cell, we also said. But here what is important to know is that T cell are coordinators. They help or they aid into the perfect function of Cd8. That will be the Cd4, the coordinators, and Cd8, the ones that will be like taken into actions through some mechanisms like cytotoxicity, just as the NK cell, right? Now we also have the B cell, which will be producing the antibody. But for this lecture, what we'll be focusing in is in T cell response, okay? Now specifically into Cd8 response. These are, I like this concept that foot soldiers, they are the sentinel, not sentinels, but they're just there, like ready to attack, and they're the ones that will be attacking, that will be taking, you know, the things into their their hands or into their receptors, as we can say. So we've got these TCD8 cells, and what happens here is we've got the pathogen. Let's say it's the SARS-CoV-2. It goes through the immature dendritic cell, which is the antigenic presenting cell. It sends the pathogen, it then processes it, and then it presents it to a naive, to a naive TCD8 cell. Now, when it presents the antigen here through its TCR and the MHC1, then it gets activated. After getting activated, then it occurs a clonal expansion or a proliferation of these activated CD8 cells. However, they're not all the same. As you can see here in the diagram, we can have at least here shown 3 types of CD8s. We've got the TRMs, which are T resident memory T cells, which will remain in tissue of primary reactions. That means that we've got these cells in the lung, and they're like really important and crucial for a good response, immune response. Then we've got the T central memory cells, which will be circulating through the secondary lymph tissue. And we've got the T effector memory cells, which will circulate through non-lymphoid tissues. So we got this type of memory T cell pool generation, but we also have the T effector cells, which are over here in this part. These are the ones that are the foot soldiers, in the sense that they will be attacking. As you can say, here is a target cell. Let's say it's an alveolar epithelial cell. This is the TCD8, and it will recognize the cell, the infected cell, and then it will attack through some mechanisms such as the release of perforins and granzymes. And this will take the cell wall into apoptosis and death. So that's why these are the responsible for the eliminations of infected cells, and they're key players in control of the viruses. Okay. So now here what we have is the CD8 T cell, and what we have here, it's just a lot of markers that could be telling about what or how the TCD8 cell is. Like, if we want to know how is the effector function, well, we have to have interferon gamma, TNF alpha, perforin, granzyme. Migration patterns, these are the chemokines that they mostly express, and of note, exhaustion markers. So what we know is that these cells could get exhausted, and this concept of exhaustion is reflected by these organ markers. It's PD1, 2B4, CD6 160. Also, other markers are TIM3 or also CTLA4, which will be seen in other slides. So we just saw that interferons are important in this TCD8 subset, but not only in this subset, but also in the innate immune response. So what we need to have like a perfect cause of that disease is to have an early and robust type 1 interferon response, just as we see here in the A diagram. So we've got a good type 1 interferon, the viral load is limited, and we've got, yes, a T cell response of antibodies, but not dramatic increase. However, if we've got a delayed type 1 interferon, then the viral load will go up. It will be too late, but still, we've got just some control of the disease. T cell response won't be that important or won't be that activated, and antibodies will go up. Those will do. There's also other scenario where we have the interferon deficiency. There have been some studies into, people with genetic diseases or maybe some other chronic diseases that have to be with some interferon deficiency. And in this setting, what we see is that the viral load goes up, it's uncontrolled, antibodies go like really up, and then T cell response, yes, it's activated, but still it's like really low. It's not like working that well, okay? And well, then what we have here is what happens to these two type of patients, you know, like the delayed or the deficiency one. Well, there's some therapies with recombinant type 1 interferon, and if we get this in a proper time, which I've been mentioning since the beginning, the timing of the therapies and all of what's happening here, then the viral load will get limited, and we've got, you know, just a good antibody and T cell response to these. So the key here is, as I mentioned here, is a robust early interferon response is likely essential in controlling COVID-19. And interferon response comes from the innate arm of the immune system at first, but then also Cd8 contribute to this interferon response. But in the setting of COVID-19, sometimes it's not that possible through the T cells. So that's why I'm passing through this slide, where it's what's happening then in COVID-19 in relation to the immune response. What we have is an altered mononuclear phagocyte differentiation. We were talking about these phagocytes, that they're like the macrophages, the ones that they like in a like easy way of saying these things, they like to eat things. So macrophages just engulf the particle, and they just endocytosis, and they just process it, and they can also present it. So these are like really important. And if we've got this altered like since the beginning, because they're part of the innate immune response, then we are in trouble. Now, also activation of intracellular killing and memory, effector, and regulatory T cell responses are also altered in the context of COVID-19. Of course, not in all of the context, not in all of the cases, I'm sorry, but yes, mostly in the, you know, mild or in the severe, of course, course of the disease. So key point here is, if we don't get viral clearance, we'll get into end organ disease. And as I just mentioned, it would be of the acute respiratory distress syndrome. It's one of the most common complications that we can see in these patients, that there's no viral clearance, and they develop to this disease. Now, investigation into Cd8 cells, it's been like different in different situations along the pandemic. At first, they weren't that investigated because other things were taken into consideration into the disease, but then like little by little, they've been just elucidating different things about the response. So this is from last year. And I like this diagram where it says we've got the naive T cell, and we've got these two scenarios, right? The mild disease is mostly refers to patients that, yes, they get symptoms, they might get ill and, you know, like not feeling quite well, but they can still be home. They don't need ventilation, they don't need the hospital. In contrast, severe disease, it means those patients that will get into the hospital and maybe will need some ventilation or ICU. So into the mild disease, we've got these activated T cells, we've got the clonal expansion, and let's just remember this. Into the immune response, we've got different steps to get a good adaptive immune response. We've got the simulation, then we've got the activation, we've got the clonal expansion, and finally we need a contraction. The contraction is when the disease is over, when there's viral clearance, then we just contract the system, and only the memory T cells are the ones that are left. Okay, so we do need that. There's just some of the elimination of these clonal cells, but until there's viral clearance. And if there's not a contraction, then we can get into immunopathology. Okay, so let's get back to this mild disease. It's clonal expansion, and we can get effector T cells, or we can get memory T cells. And what the first things that were here noted is that here we've got normal or increased T cells, well, specifically Cd8 cells. There are no dominant clones detected because there's clonal expansion, but not just of one clone, but of many clones. And there are some cytokines, chemokines, and cytotoxicity evaluated here. And it's an important remark into interferon gamma, IL-2, TNF-alpha, and also granzyme B. But there are also some co-inhibitory signals that will be markers of exhaustion as PD-1, TIM3, and CD38. However, they're not like really present there. Like if you see, like it's negative also from TIM3. So let's go to the other side of the disease. We've got the severe disease. We've got a lot of IL-6, IL-10, IL-1 beta. There's these chemokines that they're chemoattractions. I mean, like they're you know, like homing the cells into mostly the lung. And what we got is like they really didn't know, like are these T cells like less activated? Are they getting activated? Is a reduced T cell pool? Because what they just like first thing that they saw is that there was lymphopenia. And lymphopenia, the question was like, is it because of a lung recruitment, or what's going on there? Like, why is this happening? Because lymphopenia is also present in other viral responses, but in COVID-19, we didn't like know why there was so much lymphopenia, especially affecting CD8s, and also it just prevailed, you know, like you get viral clearance, but lymphopenia remained for a little time. So we also knew that there were some terminally differentiated T cells, but also exhausted like T cells, which were marked by PD-1, TIM3, CD38, and this like really important CTLA4. Okay, so there was like, this is like the general, the first idea of what we knew about CD8 response in COVID-19. But then like several researchers around the world were like investigated here, like to really know what was happening to this important subset in the disease. So this paper, I really liked it because it's the graphics went like really simple and it's easy to understand. So Barchetta et al., I really don't know how to pronounce it. What they saw is through flow cytometry is that yes, there is a really wide affection into the T cell subset, but it's mostly affected to the CD8 T subset. And then what they saw, they compared the healthy donors and COVID-19 patients, like infected with SARS-CoV-2. And as you can see here, there's an important decrease into this CD8 subset. But then they made something like really interesting here. They split the infected patients into another subgroup, into the ones that survived and the ones that didn't. So what they could see is that there was also a difference here, is that also in the death patients, there was a marked, and even more marked, reduced number of CD8 T cells. And it was like really important, and this is kind of new information, you know, because there's always like, why the elderly, and is it the elderly, or is this other things that are getting in there? So what they saw here, this group was paired into ages, and they said what was more affecting here is if the person was dead, not into the age. Okay, so what they also saw is that what's determining here is that they are exhausted. So they're like really tired, we can say, okay? And a way of seeing this cell is through some receptors like CD69, and what we were seeing here as it's elevated into dead patients as well. And that's into CD8 cells, and it happens the same here in CD4. But as you can see, the most affected subset is CD8. Now, all other marker, which is most important, is TIM3 or TIM3. And this marker is like really important to see, like to see if the cell is working correctly. And what we see is the same thing. It's elevated, significantly elevated in the cells from the COVID-19 patients, as well as in the CD4, but it's most significant in CD8 cells. So what it's left here is like, if you get like the most recent information about what's happening into this subset, is that lymphopenia is because of apoptosis. I'll show you some graphics where it's the demonstration of this apoptosis that is mediated by caspase-3, and also about just the most susceptible subset that it's affected are the ones that are secreting more IL-10. But the profile that we can see here is that numbers and frequency of CD4 and CD8 are significantly
Marcela,
lower.
just a second. Actually, someone presented the screen, so your screen presentation has stopped. Please present it again. And I would request all the participants, please do not share the screen.
Okay, so
Sorry for the interruption. So sorry.
don't worry. Let me. So let me just go into again.
Yeah, it's visible now. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just go into the big part. There. Okay, so there's a unique immune profile, as I was saying, and there's lymphopenia, but we also have this hyperactivated pan T cell exhaustion profile. So what this means is that, yes, there's activation of T cells, but they are exhausted, or they get exhausted. And we can see that through the overexpression of CD69, TIM3 in both subsets, okay? There's also a dramatic reduction in the CD8 frequency and T cell count in patients who died versus the ones that survived, and no difference were found versus the elderly, just as I was telling you. So now let's go into some other papers that have been published that are like really nice, also graphics. Here what we see is that there's other functional exhaustion markers, such as an increased expression of NAAC2A. And this also goes along with the NK cells. Remember, we were talking about the natural killer cells from the innate immune response. So these natural killer cells are really important into viral clearance from the beginning of the disease. And what we've seen is that not only the CD8s that are also, they work quite not the same, but kind of similar way, the natural killer cells and the CD8s. And both of them are exhausted, and they share kind of the same markers into the exhaustion part. So this gives a lot of hints and a lot of clues of what's happening in these patients with, you know, like a really critical COVID-19. So what else do we see here is that Th1 differentiation and survival, such as IL-12, were reduced in patients with severe and critical COVID-19, as well as interferon gamma. So let's take a look into these pie charts. So what we see here is that we've got healthy donors, mild COVID, severe and critical COVID-19. And if we go into the naive CD8 subset, we can see that healthy donors got about 30% or so. But the thing is that there's quite a reduction in critical COVID-19 compared to the mild course of the disease. So what we can interpret here is that it's really important to have these naive T cells. So this is a really nice, it's kind of demonstrated / theory that is being presenting here. It's about that why children don't get these severe course. I mean, there's a way that children can get like really affected, but most of them, they just are like asymptomatic. They don't get a lot of the symptoms or like severe disease. And this is the theory says that it's because they've got more naive cells. Naive cells are the ones that are ready to respond, to get into contact to a new antigen and, you know, like mount a whole new adaptive immune response, versus just an elderly or an adult, let's go with adult, that it's just, you know, it's been the whole life, it's been just also implicated into just so many immune response that they're not that much of naive, maybe cells, or they're not just working as well, right? We've got more memory cells an adult has than a children. And then let's go to the elderly. I mean, elderly, why are they affected? There's another concept really important in immunology that it's called the senescence of cells, which I'm not gonna get much into it, but I'm just gonna tell you that there's a project, an ongoing project with senescence and exhaustion in our lab currently. And this might impact into this Th1 differentiation, as well as all of the functions of the immune response. And as we can see here, one of the most affected T subset, Cd8 subset, is a T memory cell, T central memory cell, the one in blue. So all of these little pieces of the map will give us just an understanding of what's happening. And this, in the right part, what I am putting you here is a nice graphic. In the y-axis, what we have is a caspase-3 activity, which represents, or what it means is apoptosis, like is caspase-3 apoptosis mediated of the T cells. What we were talking about, like if they're exhausted, is because if there's lymphopenia, there's more apoptosis, okay? So now, what we see is that in a critical course of that disease, there's reduced caspase-3 activity, okay? And in mild disease, there is more of this activity. So just going along with more information that is recently out there about alterations of Cd8 subset, what we've got here, we can see is COVID-19 in just an adult age and compared to healthy donors. Then we've got COVID-19 in the setting of an elderly, and also in the healthy elderly, okay, not infected patients or subjects. So now in colors, what is shown is a different Cd8 subsets, and this graph, what we're seeing is the percentage of the frequency of Cd8 cells, right? What we see here is that there's a change. There are much more effector cells in the adults than in the infected adults than in the healthy adults, as well as there's just a reduction into the transitional memory cells and also about the naive, okay? Now, what we can see in the elderly is that the ones that got the COVID-19, this is a really high response into the effector cells. And let's look at the naive compartment. As you can see, it's like really small, as well as in the healthy subjects. So here what we can see is that naive cells are like really important into this right response into the Cd8 subcell, as well as in the Cd4, but we're focusing here in the Cd8. So there's a change. I mean, like you can see here, it's completely easy to see that there's a change into this subset of the Cd8 cells, and it will be an ongoing Cd8 T cell response in COVID-19 patients. So it's important to know that it depends on these subsets of Cd8 cells. So as I was telling you, explaining you, that Cd8 cells function this way. They, of course, they get activated first as we saw first with the antigen presenting cell, and then they got into their TCR, and this TCR will, detect the infected cell through in the context of the MHC, and then while it's detected, it needs other signals. Remember that for the immune response to get there, we need the activation, we need the co-stimulation, and we need the cytokines or the chemokines. In this, this is like really simple image, but we got the interferon gamma or the interferons that are helping here to induce the response and or to activate the cell. And how is it gonna work? The CTL, it will release a group of these things that are called perforins and granzymes. And perforins, as it said, it will be get it into the membrane and will make holes into the cell, and then it will pass the granzyme, which will aid into the destruction of the cell. So in this sense, we know that granzymes are really important, as well as perforins. Why? Because they are telling us how is the cell working, or like, is the cell working, is the activation state correctly? And this beautiful paper, it's what it's saying here, it's comparing the COVID-19 adults and the COVID-19 elderlies. And what we can see here is that granzyme is quite similar, but if we go into a subset of cells that are expressing, this is important here, they're expressing the PD-1 marker. And you might say, okay, Marcela, they are exhausted cells, they are not working. Well, the thing is here that as research has been ongoing, it's been noticed that PD-1 is not enough to determine that it's an exhausted type of cell, because PD-1 is also activated or expressed as soon as the cell is activated. So what we see here is that there's a percentage of PD-1 positive cells that express granzyme, and that in the adult infected subjects will be statistically increased compared to the healthy donors or to the elderly. So what we can see here is that maybe these patients over here are the ones that got like the best response in the context, or like talking into the scope of CD8s, okay? And the same thing happens with perforin. We've got PD-1 positive cells, and we've got these adults infected people, and there's a significant difference between these people and the healthy people. And there's no difference here in the elderly. So what we can see is that, yes, there's a deficient CD8 response in the elderly, and maybe in some of the patients, but here is just and it's just the example of a general way of the patients. So this is a slide to just a little bit to summarize what all of the graphics were telling you. So we've got that NAAC cells and T cell exhaustions, it will be following an exaggerated virus-driven activation. And what will happen here is that IL-6, as I was telling you at the beginning, may downregulate NAKG2D on NAK cells. And then the COVID-19 will resemble in part of the macrophage activation syndrome, which is thought to be closely related to HLH. And well, these syndromes, these thing that is happening here is just what is saying is what happens with this hyperinflammatory state that it's sometimes happening in COVID-19. And it's been similar to this, but not quite. So there's not been just like a specific name, but the cytokine storm, what we've seen. So we've seen some enrichment in terminally differentiated, functionally exhausted NAK cells, also of hyperactivated T cells, and of course the increased level of IL-6, especially in monocytes that will be secreting these inflammatory cytokines, okay? Now, just keeping in mind of this hyperinflammatory state, we see that there's the reduced sequencing of these NK cells, which also have this marker. And the thing important here is not for you to remember the markers, but to know that those markers are associated with reduced NK cell function in viral infection. So once again, since the beginning, we need a good response. And if since the beginning, or since this part of the team that will be the innate immune response or the NAAC cell response is not good, then we have no good or better expectations for the adaptive immune response to take into place. Okay. So going along with more papers here, more graphics, I'm gonna go like quicker here so you don't get bored or sleep. There's a functional exhaustion. So we've got the number of T cells, and in this paper, they're separated by healthy controls, mild, and severe. So we see that as the course of the disease goes worse, then there will be a reduction of these CD8 cells. Okay. Now, same happens with NAAC cells, as I just said, and also with those markers of exhaustion that will go increase into these subset of patients. Now, there are also the things that researchers are getting, quantified and determined into the cells, such as interferon gamma. And what we see, this is like really beautiful. Like, see here, we've got the healthy controls, which are the blue, and we've got the SARS-CoV-2. Interferon gamma expressing cells are way increased into healthy donors compared to the SARS-CoV-2 patients, which depends also, of course, into what time the patients were taken. But here, the important thing here is that there's a deficient response into the NK cell subset in this setting. Okay, now the CD8 cell has the same effect, as you can see, and it's also statistically significant. So once again, interferon gamma, NK cells are like quite important for the development of the disease. Also, IL-2 secretion is like really important. We also have here the granzyme B that we also reviewed, and the TNF alpha that in this case is the other way around. Okay, now what we also see here is like in the bottom part of the image is that what happens after the disease, like in convalescent patients that they were just after the disease, is that, well, it get into normal numbers most of the time, like numbers of CTLs, and here is the response. Okay, but it's kind of slow, and sometimes it just doesn't happen. And then finally, so I've been talking about elderly, I've been talking about mild, I've been talking about the severe or critical course of the disease. But what happens in the asymptomatic? Maybe most of you got COVID-19 or got infected, but you really didn't get the disease. I mean, you were a SARS-CoV-2 positive result, but you didn't get the disease. So you weren't COVID-19 patient, you were just an infected patient with asymptomatic things. So there's this nice study. It was quite elegant study. It's a longitudinal single cell transcriptome sequencing, and what they saw is that there's an increase of interferon gamma and these chemokines and markers on T cells, and an expansion of like subset expression TNF receptors subfamily member 19. So there, of course, also special markers and special characteristics of the asymptomatic patients. What also they saw is that there was a significantly increase of CD4 T lymphocytes or T effector cells compared to severe cases. What this is telling us is that maybe there was not that much virus, or the virus could be kind of limited or controlled with the innate immune response. And then there's a good orchestrated response of the CD4. There's maybe not that much lymphopenia, and the CD4 got like, like they're like the drivers. They coordinate and they say like which cytokine which should like go up or down, and at what time would that be. Now, there's also be like an increased proportion of the Cd8 T memory subset, and also moderate and severe patients had increased Cd8 T effector cells. Okay. Give me just a second because I got just one call. Okay, so I'm so sorry for that. It was something from the lab. Now, cell populations in the lung. Let's go into the local. This will be just like the final part of promise, so you can go and have a rest. Cell populations in the lung. So first of all, they're heterogeneous population. They mediate protection and maintain homeostasis. But the thing here is, could they promote immunopathology? I mean, like, far from making something good, can they just make the disease outcome worse? So just let's take a quick look at this drawing here, at this diagram. And what we can see is, yes, we got here the alveolus. I mean, what we're seeing here is the lung, assuming to the lung. And here is the airway, the gray part. And what I want to make sure here that you see is this. We got the Cd8 tissue resident memory cells, which are these ones. Okay, why are they there? They're in between the epithelial cells. They're interepithelial cells, and they're there so they can get the signal as quick as possible, and because they got memory. Okay, that's one of the characteristics of the adaptive immune system. So as soon as the antigen or the the pathogen wants to come in again and infect the cell, then these cells are crucial into limiting this infection. So that is, besides from the antibodies, a crucial part of the immune response for those who get COVID-19 or vaccinated, the generation of these T cells. Okay, so as well as these T cells, we also have got these macrophages, which I was telling you, they're the alveolar macrophages, and we've got other elements here. But the lung immunopathology in the context of a viral disease or in the SARS-CoV-2 infection, we've got two scenarios. We've got the cytokine storm, which might be dependent mostly of the innate immune response, and here we can see the macrophage that it's in a lot of cytokines, TNF-alpha, IL-8, and we have also here this group of cytokines that are quite important into the innate immune response and the control of the adaptive immune response. So we've got IL-1, especially IL-6 and IL-10. IL-10 is an immunosuppressing cytokine, which is also important for the correct coordination of the immune response. Now, there's also this cytokine storm. It's not the only elements that are secreted in cytokines, but also other elements such as monocytes that are circulating in the body, also T cells, NK cells, neutrophils that can contribute into the cytokine storm. So cytokine storm, the definition is just an exaggerated secretion of pro-inflammatory cytokines that are making damage into the tissue that it's getting that response, or that the tissue that it's just they're getting all the effects of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. So now this also could be T cell mediated through the adaptive immune response. That would be just as we were talking about the T cell, especially the CD8 cell compartment, where these cells, they just secrete also a lot of maybe interferon gamma, other cytokines, as well as just perforins and granzymes. And this just, it would be like crazy. Imagine just this airway where there's a lot of cytokines, and like the CD4 doesn't really know what to do. It doesn't know if it goes to a Th1 phenotype, which would be the ideal phenotype, or into a Th2. And then these CD4, it's like getting crazy with all these cytokines, and it doesn't really know what instruction to give to CD8. And CD8 is also getting like really stimulated with all of the cytokines that it's all over it. So that's what happened. This is a lung immunopathology that gets into these severe patients that maybe they have got viral parents. I mean, like there's they are negative for SARS-CoV-2, but SARS-CoV-2 just like, okay, I made my party, now I'll just leave. Okay, and all of this is happening, like a lot of tissue damage into the local response. So getting into the context that these tissue resident memory cells are crucial for protection. Here we have like how they get activated. We've got the naive cells. They got, as I just mentioned, with the antigen presentation. Then they go to the circulation. They could, continue into the circulation, get into effector memory cells, or maybe they could get into peripheral tissues such as lung, intestines, skin, liver, brain, or genital mucosa, and they will get this phenotype. This is quite important: CD69, CD100 or 103, which are homing markers for the cell to stay there. So this is why it's like really difficult to just get these cells, like to measure them it's quite complicated. So this is just, I'm not gonna get into this because I think I just got a bit out of time. But the thing here is for you to remember that the immune response, it will be depending not only in the cell, not only in the part of the body, like in the lung, the immune response is quite different from the circulation response. And it will also depend on to what viral protein is responding to. So it is the membrane, the nucleocapsid, or the S protein, okay? And here is quite of the same of the past, but here what we can see is like CD8 cells, like what markers are they expressing, if it's interferon or is it L4, IL-10, and depending on the viral protein that it's stimulating the cell. So those are like special and very important considerations to take into place when there's the design of vaccine, mostly of vaccine or treatments to limit the response. And here is just to exemplify how the lung and the blood immune responses are different, like one from each other, and also they're different, again, depending on the viral protein that the cells are responding to. And finally, this is the last one. I really, really recommend you to read about or read the papers of this great researcher, which is Donna Farber. And she is a specialist in this immune response locally. She also has a lot of papers about influenza. I really exhort you to just review some of her papers. And what we have here is there's a higher CD8 cells in patients who survive, as well as the younger patients in airway, and there were no correlations in blood. So the key point here is that we need a good CD8 cells. That's one part. And also that blood, yeah, it's good to measure it, but just take it like a really in consideration that the local immune response in the lung are really responsible for what's going on, okay? So there are just some key points that you must keep in mind. So just that would be like it for the presentation. Here we're just presenting some of the ongoing projects that we have in our life. As I said, it's this project about cellular exhaustion and also senescent phenotypes and its relationship with viral clearance and the resolution of symptoms. Also T cell activation and Pfizer vaccinated subjects. And also there's this system, it's epidemiological vigilance system of mutations, where we here have some elements. So we can see if we've got the E484K mutation, also some deletions and so on. So the samples that we detect mutations, they get into sequencing, and then we can have this tracking of what's going on in our country, or at least in our state. So at last, take-home messages. Please remember that patients with poor prognosis will have an enrichment in terminal differentiated functionally exhausted, this is a key word, exhausted NK cells and hyperactivated T cells. Of course, there's a lot of IL-6 that will be coming from monocytes and a lot of also inflammatory cytokines. Now, let's also remember that there's important differences in lung and circulatory immune responses. with macrophages are like the greatest contributors, and also the TRM cells, which are like quite important to make these role into the immune defense and memory, okay, in locally talking. So it's been demonstrated that these cells are around 10 months, but let's see what happens with the vaccine, the vaccine experiments that they're just ongoing. And here I present you the lab. They're most of the team of the lab. This is the lab is emerging and re-emerging disease detection laboratory, and well, most of us are back now to our daily activities, but others are still at the lab. And thank you very much. I appreciate your attention, and I'm open to any questions that you might ask.
I would request if participants have anything to ask, we can take few questions. You may turn on your mic and you may ask any question if you have.
No, I mean, maybe they're just tired because I think it's kind of late at your country. But I just like really invite you to, you know, continue with the measures for SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. And if you're interested into research, like there's no reason to be scared into whatever topic you're interested into.
Well, I don't think they have anything to ask, but I must say this was one of the most wonderful and one of the most elaborative session I have attended ever. And as you spoke about the rise of COVID across the whole globe and the overview of SARS-CoV-19, which was inch perfect. And you also spoke about how the virus gets its entry into our cells. And you also covered the pathology and symptoms of COVID-19. And especially the immune response, like there are two kinds of immune responses, like the innate immunity and the adaptive immunity. That was really impressive. And the way you considered CD8 cells to be the foot soldier or the sentinels, as you said, of the adaptive immune response was really wonderful.
Thank you.
And the parts you covered, it was so alarming and also, you know, very much freshening for us, you know, because we heard it for the first time. And as we all are, you know, experiencing a tough time, and I don't think I would have got a better resource person than you, who can, you know, share thoughts and the process of, you know, how you are coping up with this COVID-19. So thank you so much, Marcela, for joining us. And it was really a wonderful session, and we really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you for the invitation, and I hope you're all well.
Yeah, and I would now request Yamunur Khatun, Assistant Professor of Department of English, please propose a formal vote of thanks to our both the speakers.
Okay, you can hear me, right?
Yeah, you are audible.
Thank you, Chandan, for giving me this opportunity to express a vote of thanking event for this particularly excellent and wonderful webinar in front of the two speakers who did really well, and that was very much fascinating, particularly for me. I've been mesmerized. Now, for our speakers, let me address you by saying that it's a Spanish term that I have been learning. Estimadas señoritas, is that okay, ma'am?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm very sorry. It's very unfortunate that Dr. Valentina CAMOMILLA, she's not here right now, but I'm addressing both of you. I want to thank you because you owe us a vote of thanks, both of you, Dr. Valentina CAMOMILLA and Dr. Marcela Rodriguez. So on behalf of this institution, this college, that is PANCHMURA Mahavidyalaya, I, Yaminul Khatun, am embracing you with a hearty welcome and hearty vote of thanks because for you are here, for being here, for sharing your expertise with us. It's been, I told you already, it's been an excellent session, and I've been listening to it, and I'm sure, quite sure, that the audience too is very intrigued by the excellently informative and enlightening speech delivery. However, I thank Dr. Valentina CAMOMILLA for her insightful speech, touching upon the areas like the strategic approach to sports, injury forecasting, and complexity. She did talk about data query pathway and actuation strategy of sending positive and constructive feedback. And most intriguingly, she did talk about the athletes with or having disability. This being particularly my research interest, I enjoyed that part a lot. However, she did also talk about the gap between the theatrical research work and the field work, and she also tried to discuss ways to reduce it. I thank you, Dr. Marcela Rodriguez, for your very timely and wonderful deliberation. I have been listening to it, the details that you shared with us regarding the cells like T cells, B cells, the cytotoxicity, toxicity, and the NK cells, and how they're altered and how they form immunity response. As Chandan was already saying, that you mentioned innate response, immunity response, and you mentioned adaptive immunity response, and that was fascinating, particularly fascinating for me. And also you did, ma'am, talk about, I would like to particularly mention the part detailing the the proposed CD8 cell response in relation to the alterations of TCD8 in COVID-19 in case of the elderly patients, the severe or moderately infected patients, and also the asymptomatic patients. So you also learned about the functional characteristics of acute SARS-CoV-2 specific T cells. That was amazing. Once again, I am telling you, and trust me, madam, that it could, I mean, this delivery, this speech delivery could extend further and further without making us a little bit bored. We were not bored, we were enjoying, and we were not tired. Actually, you did so excellently, so that we couldn't come up with questions. You actually made us see through whatever you wanted to convey. That was amazing. Lastly, I would just go to thank others. That is the chief patron of our college, our principal, inspiration always, Dr. Onikash. I would like to thank Chandan Kumar Paswan for his initiative. He has been anchoring this event with efficiency, of course, and I would thank the technical support, Mr. Vijay Kumar Paswan, not obviously forgetting the organizing committee members. They did well too. And I would, last but not the least, would extend my thanks to the audience who, for their cooperative and patient deliberation, cooperation and presence participation. And this is a kind of non-academic or non-official request from our part, ma'am, to invite you on behalf of our college, of course, of our institution, to visit us someday, maybe maybe when the pandemic allows us to. So do come and visit us. We will just love it. Let me just put it in Espanol, like Venga a vernos algún día. Was that right? Again?
Yes, really good, really good. Now then you have to come here too.
Yeah, we will definitely. I would love to because I was excited, particularly excited because you're from Mexico, and I really want to go there. I really do. However, ma'am, thank you once again. Many thanks and buenas noches.
Well, thank you also for that really nice things that you said, and for all of you to be here patiently, because I know it's late for you. So, well, I'm just stopping here so we can get this concluded. But really, thank you for everything, your attention and your efficient, like information and everything.
Thank
Muchas
you, ma'am.
gracias, Dr. Marcela. Thank you. Participants, you will get your feedback form by tonight, and within 10 days, you will receive your certificates. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you all will join us in our future endeavors too. And thank you for being such a patient, lots of participant, you listened. And thank you so much once again for joining us.
Always, Chandrasen. Thank you so much.
Okay, Amrit sir, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
So, Chandan, with your permission, I'm leaving. No.
Ma'am, thank you so much to you also. It was really wonderful to hear you.
Actually, I was thinking I didn't let you down. Okay? Did I?
No, ma'am. It was wonderful.
Okay,
It was
okay.
so
Thank you.
eloquently done. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Please share the feedback link.
It will be sent by tonight, sir.
Hello.
You will receive your feedback link in your mail or in the WhatsApp group.
Please share the feedback link.
It will be shared in your mail, sir, by tonight.
Sir, feedback link ki ache?
Hello. Am I audible, Mr. Vipin Basu?
Sir, kono feedback link ki ache?
Mail paben, sir. Mail.
Acha, thank you.
Okay.
Sir, thank you so much. খুব সুন্দর প্রোগ্রাম হয়েছে স্যার।
ওকে
স্যার অনেক ধন্যবাদ আপনাকে।
স্যার পিপিটি কি শেয়ার করবেন? স্যার পিপিটি কি শেয়ার করবেন?
হ্যাঁ, মেল করব আমি, মেল করব আপনার সবাইকে।
আচ্ছা, পিপিটি গুলো মেল করব। থ্যাংক ইউ।
ওকে।
हेलो सर, गुड नाइट।
गुड नाइट।
थैंक यू सर।
दलवीर सर, थैंक यू आने के लिए।